My daughter invited me to dinner with her rich fiancé and his family. At the end of the night, he whispered something in Mandarin to her about my clothes, and they both laughed. Before leaving, I smiled, turned to his mother, and said in perfect Mandarin, "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached." I stared at the text message from my daughter Lenny, reading it for the third time. "Mom, Troy wants to take you out to dinner tomorrow night. His family will be there too. 7 p.m. at Golden Dragon. Please dress nice." The way she wrote "please dress nice" made my stomach tighten, but I pushed the feeling aside. This was important to her, and after everything we'd been through since her father left, I wanted to be the mother she could be proud of. I spent the entire next day preparing. At 65, I didn't have much in terms of fancy clothes, but I had a navy blue dress I'd worn to church for years and a small string of pearls my own mother had given me. I even went to the salon on 5th Street and spent $40 I couldn't really afford to have my gray hair styled. When I looked in the mirror before leaving, I thought I looked respectable, maybe even elegant. The Golden Dragon was the kind of place I'd driven past 100 times, but never imagined eating at. Valet parking, crystal chandeliers visible through the windows, men in suits and women dripping with jewelry. My hands felt clammy as I walked through the heavy glass doors, suddenly aware of how my shoes squeaked slightly on the polished marble floor. I spotted Lenny immediately. She was sitting at a large round table near the center of the restaurant, wearing a cream-colored dress that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Next to her sat Troy, and I had to admit he was handsome in that polished way that comes with money. His black hair was perfectly styled, his suit looked like something from a magazine, and when he smiled, his teeth were blindingly white. Around the table sat what I assumed was his family. An older woman who could only be his mother, wearing a burgundy silk dress and enough gold jewelry to stock a small store. An older man in an expensive-looking suit who barely glanced up when I approached. 2 other couples, all impeccably dressed, all with that same polished perfection that made me feel like I was wearing a costume to a play I didn't understand. "Mom!" Lenny stood up and hugged me, but it felt stiff, performative. "Everyone, this is my mother, Alma." The introductions were polite but cold. Troy's mother, Mrs. Chen, extended a limp hand and gave me a smile that never reached her eyes. The others nodded and murmured hellos before immediately returning to their conversations. I was seated between Troy's mother and an empty chair, clearly the least important spot at the table. The menu was entirely in Chinese with small English translations underneath, and the prices made my eyes water. The cheapest entree was $38. I ordered the least expensive thing I could find, a simple chicken dish, while everyone else seemed to order multiple courses without even looking at the prices. That's when the comments started. Troy's mother leaned over to him and said something in Mandarin, gesturing subtly toward my dress. Whatever she said made Troy smirk, and he responded in the same language. They both glanced at me and then looked away, continuing their conversation as if I wasn't sitting right there. I caught Lenny's eye, hoping for some translation or at least acknowledgement of how rude this was, but she was looking at her phone. More Mandarin flowed around the table, and I started noticing a pattern. They would speak English when talking about the weather or the restaurant, but whenever the conversation turned to anything personal, they switched to Mandarin. Troy's father said something that made the whole table laugh, and I saw him glance at my pearl necklace. The laughter felt pointed, directed. My face burned with embarrassment, but I kept smiling, pretending everything was normal. The worst part came when the food arrived. Troy's mother made another comment in Mandarin, this time clearly referring to how I was holding my chopsticks. I'd tried my best, but I was obviously struggling, and she was critiquing my technique to the entire table. Troy added something that made his father chuckle and shake his head. What hurt most was watching Lenny. My daughter, who I'd raised alone after her father abandoned us when she was 12, who I'd worked double shifts to put through college, was sitting there laughing along with them. When Troy made what was obviously another joke about me, she actually giggled. I excused myself to the restroom, needing a moment to collect myself. In the mirror, I saw what they saw. A 65-year-old woman in a dress from JCPenney, with salon hair that already looked flat, wearing costume jewelry and struggling with chopsticks in a world where she clearly didn't belong. When I returned to the table, the conversation had shifted back to English, and they were discussing wedding plans, venue options, guest lists, honeymoon destinations. I tried to participate, offering suggestions based on what I could afford to contribute, but my words seemed to fall into a void. "Oh, Mrs. Rodriguez," Troy said, using my maiden name instead of my married name, though I'd never corrected him. "You don't need to worry about any of that. We have everything handled." The way he said it made it clear that my input wasn't just unwelcome, it was irrelevant. As the evening wound down, Troy's mother made one final comment in Mandarin, this time looking directly at me as she spoke. Whatever she said made Troy laugh out loud, and even Lenny smiled. I sat there, nodding politely, pretending I didn't care that I was being discussed like an object in a language I supposedly couldn't understand. When we were saying our goodbyes outside the restaurant, Troy walked me to my old Honda Civic while the others waited by his BMW. He leaned in close and said, "Thank you for coming tonight, Mrs. Rodriguez. Lenny is lucky to have such a simple mother." The pause before simple made it clear it wasn't a compliment. I drove home in silence, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. Everything they'd said in Mandarin echoed in my mind. Every laugh, every pointed glance. I understood now why Lenny had asked me to dress nice. She was ashamed of me, and she wanted me to at least try to not embarrass her in front of her new family. But what they didn't know, what none of them could have guessed, was that I understood every single word they'd said. I sat in my kitchen that night, still wearing the navy dress, staring at the cold cup of tea in my hands. The words from dinner replayed in my mind with perfect clarity. Troy's mother calling my dress something from a thrift store for poor people. Troy himself commenting that I looked like a cleaning lady trying to dress up. His father asking if I was one of those Americans who never learned proper manners. But the comment that cut deepest came from Troy, when he told his mother, "Don't worry about her. Lenny is embarrassed by her too. She'll keep her distance once we're married." And my daughter, my own flesh and blood, had simply nodded in agreement. They had no idea that for 12 years, I had worked as a translator and cultural liaison at the Chinese consulate in downtown Los Angeles. That I was fluent in both Mandarin and Cantonese. That I had helped hundreds of families navigate immigration paperwork, translated legal documents, and bridged cultural gaps between East and West. That knowledge of Chinese language and culture had been my profession, my passion, my expertise. I walked to my bedroom and opened the bottom drawer of my dresser, pulling out a wooden box I hadn't touched in years. Inside were my certificates, letters of recommendation, and photos from my years at the consulate. There I was, 20 years younger, standing next to diplomats and community leaders, wearing the confident smile of a woman who knew her worth. That woman felt like a stranger now. The irony wasn't lost on me. When Robert left us, when Lenny was just 12, I had to give up my position at the consulate. The job required travel, long hours, sometimes weekend work, and I couldn't manage it as a single mother. So I took a job at the DMV, something steady with predictable hours and benefits, something that would let me be home when Lenny needed me. I remembered those years so clearly. Coming home exhausted from dealing with frustrated customers all day, then helping Lenny with her homework at the kitchen table. Making dinner from whatever was on sale at the grocery store, stretching every dollar until payday. Sitting in the bleachers at her soccer games, the only parent there in a DMV uniform because I'd come straight from work. When Lenny was accepted to UCLA, I was so proud I cried right there in the high school counselor's office. But the tuition, even with her partial scholarship, was more than I made in 6 months, so I took a second job, cleaning offices at night after my DMV shift. For 4 years, I worked 14-hour days, coming home at midnight to collapse into bed, only to wake up at 6 a.m. and do it all over again. I never complained, never made her feel guilty about the cost. When she called home crying about organic chemistry or struggling with a research paper, I was there with encouragement and support. When she needed money for textbooks or lab fees or just to feel normal among her classmates who seemed to have endless spending money, I found a way to send it. After graduation, Lenny got a good job at a marketing firm. She moved to a nice apartment in West Hollywood, started wearing designer clothes, began dating men who drove expensive cars. Our phone calls became shorter, less frequent. She was building a life, and I was proud of her success, even as I felt her pulling away. When she introduced me to Troy 6 months ago, I was nervous, but excited. My daughter was happy, talking about marriage and a future with someone who clearly adored her. She told me he came from a good family, that his parents were successful business owners who had immigrated from Taiwan and built a small empire of restaurants. What she didn't tell me was that they looked down on her background, on me, on everything I represented in her life. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through our text messages from the past few months. Looking at them now, with fresh eyes, I could see the pattern. Her responses getting shorter, less personal, no more calls just to chat, no more invitations to visit her apartment. And when I suggested taking her to lunch for her birthday, she'd said she was too busy, but maybe we could do something low-key instead. Low-key, like me, like my house, like my life. I thought about calling her, demanding an explanation, asking why she'd sat there and let them humiliate me, but I already knew what she'd say, that I was being too sensitive, that I'd misunderstood something, that Troy's family was just particular about traditions and formality. The next morning, I woke up with a headache and the lingering taste of shame. I called in sick to work, something I'd done maybe 5 times in the past decade, and spent the day in my bathrobe, replaying every moment from dinner. My phone rang around noon. Lenny's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment, my heart lifted. Maybe she was calling to apologize, to explain, to acknowledge what had happened. "Hi, Mom?" Her voice sounded strained. "I just wanted to thank you for last night. I know Troy's family can be a little formal, but they really liked you. Liked me. After everything I'd heard, everything they'd said about my appearance, my background, my worthiness to be in their presence, she was telling me they liked me. Did they?" I asked, testing her response. "Oh yes, definitely. Troy's mother mentioned how polite you were, and his father thought you seemed very respectful." The pause before respectful told me everything I needed to know. She was lying to me. My own daughter was lying to protect their cruelty, or maybe to protect herself from acknowledging her part in it. Either way, it felt like another betrayal. "That's nice to hear," I said, playing along. "Listen, I should probably mention that Troy's family is very traditional. They have certain expectations about how things should be done. So if we do family events in the future, it might be helpful if you—" She trailed off. "If I what, Lenny?" "If you maybe dressed a little more formally, and maybe let me know ahead of time what you're planning to wear. I just want to make sure everyone's comfortable. Everyone's comfortable, except me." "Of course," I heard myself saying. "I understand." After I hung up, I sat in my living room looking at the photos on my mantle. Lenny's graduation from high school, from college, pictures of us on the few vacations we could afford. In every single photo, I was beaming with pride at my daughter. But looking at them now, I wondered if she'd ever felt the same pride in me. That afternoon, I made a decision that would change everything. I opened my laptop and began researching Troy's family, their restaurants, their background. If I was going to continue being part of Lenny's life, if I was going to have to endure more evenings like last night, I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with. And as I began to dig deeper into their perfect family facade, I started to realize that perhaps I wasn't the only one keeping secrets. 2 weeks after that humiliating dinner, I found myself standing outside Chen's Golden Palace, the flagship restaurant of Troy's family business. I'd driven past it dozens of times over the years, but never paid much attention. Now, studying the ornate facade and expensive cars in the parking lot, I was trying to understand the family that my daughter was so eager to join. I hadn't planned to go inside, But when I saw a help wanted sign in the window for a part-time hostess position, something clicked. My Mandarin was rusty but still fluent, and I needed to understand these people better. More importantly, I needed to understand what Lenny saw in this world that was worth abandoning her own mother for. The interview was brief. Mrs. Chen herself conducted it, and I could see her surprise when I responded to her Mandarin test questions without hesitation. My years at the consulate had given me not just language skills, but cultural knowledge that impressed even her. She hired me on the spot for weekend shifts. Working at the restaurant was enlightening in ways I hadn't expected. I watched the family dynamics, saw how they treated their employees, listened to conversations they assumed only family members could understand. Mrs. Chen was demanding and critical, quick to berate staff in rapid Mandarin for minor mistakes. Mr. Chen rarely spoke at all, but when he did, his words carried the weight of absolute authority. And Troy. Troy was charming to customers, attentive to his parents, but there was something calculated about everything he did. He would switch between English and Mandarin mid-sentence, sometimes to exclude people from conversations, sometimes to say things he didn't want certain people to understand. It was during my third weekend shift that I overheard the conversation that changed everything. I was wiping down tables in the back section when Troy's phone rang. He was standing near the kitchen entrance, thinking he was alone, and he answered in English. "Yeah, the wedding is still on schedule," he said, his voice low but clear. "End of June, just like we planned." I kept cleaning, pretending not to listen, but every word felt like ice in my veins. No, she doesn't suspect anything. The girl is completely naive. She actually thinks this is about love. Troy laughed, a sound that made my skin crawl. Her mother is even worse. You should see her trying so hard to fit in. It's pathetic. My hand stilled on the table I was cleaning. He was talking about us. About Lenny and me. Listen, the timeline is simple. We get married in June. I file for permanent residency in July. And by Christmas, I'll have my green card secured. After that. He switched to Mandarin, and his words hit me like physical blows. After that, I'll get rid of the American girl. She's served her purpose. Her mother too, obviously. They're both too stupid to realize they're being used. I felt the blood drain from my face. Troy continued talking, now fully in Mandarin, apparently feeling safe that no one around could understand him. The beauty of it is that the girl thinks she's marrying up. She's so desperate to be part of a successful family that she'll believe anything. And the mother is so grateful that anyone wants her pathetic daughter that she won't ask questions. My legs felt weak. I gripped the edge of the table to steady myself as Troy's voice continued, each word more devastating than the last. The girl has some money saved, plus she'll inherit from her mother eventually. Not much, but enough to make this worthwhile while I establish myself here. Once I have citizenship, I can bring my real fiancé over from Shanghai. Real fiancé. The words echoed in my mind as I realized the full scope of what I was hearing. Wei Lin has been waiting for almost 2 years now, but she understands the plan. This American marriage is business, nothing more. The stupid girl actually thinks I love her. He laughed again, and this time the sound made me feel sick. Troy switched back to English, apparently talking to someone else now. Yeah, my parents know the whole plan. They're not happy about the deception, but they understand it's necessary. The old woman especially is useful because she makes the girl feel guilty about keeping us apart from her family. I realized he was talking about me. I was the old woman who was making Lenny feel guilty. The mother is so desperate to be included that she'll do anything we ask. We've already got her jumping through hoops, dressing differently, acting differently. It's honestly entertaining to watch her try so hard to please us. My chest felt tight, like I couldn't breathe properly. Everything from that dinner made horrible sense now. The comments in Mandarin weren't just casual cruelty, they were part of a calculated plan to isolate and control both Lenny and me. The wedding will be expensive, but the girl's paying for most of it herself. She's so excited to contribute to our dream that she's already drained half her savings account. By the time I'm done, there won't be much left for her to start over with. I thought about Lenny's recent comments about wedding expenses. how proud she seemed to be contributing to costs that I knew were beyond her means. She'd mentioned taking out a loan, selling some of her investments. She was funding her own betrayal. The best part is that when I leave her, everyone will assume she drove me away by being too clingy or demanding. American women have such a reputation for being difficult. No one will question my side of the story. Troy's conversation was winding down, but I'd heard enough. More than enough. I finished cleaning the table with shaking hands and made my way to the employee break room, where I sat down heavily and tried to process what I'd just learned. My daughter, my beautiful, intelligent daughter, was being manipulated by a man who saw her as nothing more than a path to citizenship. And I, the woman who had sacrificed everything to give her a better life, was being used as a tool to make her feel ashamed and isolated. But the worst part wasn't even Troy's deception. It was the realization that Lenny had been so eager to distance herself from me, so ashamed of her background, that she'd made herself vulnerable to this kind of manipulation. In trying to escape the life I'd given her, she'd walked straight into a trap. I sat there for 10 minutes, letting the full impact settle in. Then I made a decision that surprised even me. I wasn't going to run to Lenny with this information. I wasn't going to cry or rage or demand explanations. Instead, I was going to let Troy continue thinking I was just a pathetic old woman who didn't understand what was happening around her. I was going to keep working at this restaurant, keep listening, keep learning everything I could about his plan. Because if Troy thought he could use my daughter and discard her like trash, if he thought he could manipulate me into helping him destroy my own child's future, then he had severely underestimated the woman he was dealing with. I might be 65 years old, I might work at the DMV and struggle to pay my bills, but I had something Troy didn't realize I possessed: patience, determination, and the absolute fury of a mother whose child was being threatened, and I spoke fluent Mandarin. Over the next month, I became the perfect invisible observer. Troy and his family continued to treat me like furniture at the restaurant, speaking freely in Mandarin about their plans while I cleaned tables and seated customers just a few feet away. What I learned during those weeks built a picture so disturbing that even I, who had seen the worst of what people could do to each other during my consulate years, was shocked. Troy wasn't just using Lenny for a green card. He was part of a systematic operation that his family had been running for years. This wasn't his first marriage to an American woman. Through careful listening and some discreet research during my lunch breaks, I discovered that he had been married twice before, both times to women who had later mysteriously decided to divorce him just after his citizenship paperwork was finalized. The first wife, Sarah, had been a teacher from Oregon. She'd married Troy in Las Vegas 3 years ago, then filed for divorce 8 months later, claiming irreconcilable differences. She'd left California entirely, moving back to Oregon with no explanation to friends or family. The second wife, Jennifer, had been a nurse from Arizona. Same pattern, same timeline, same mysterious decision to divorce and disappear from the social circles where she'd met Troy. What made it even more sinister was how the family operated as a unit. Mrs. Chen would befriend the wives, offering motherly advice and cultural guidance. Mr. Chen would play the wise patriarch, sharing stories about traditional values and family loyalty. They'd make the women feel special, chosen, like they were being welcomed into something exclusive and meaningful, all while systematically isolating them from their own families and draining their financial resources. I learned about Wei Lin, Troy's actual girlfriend in Shanghai, through fragments of phone conversations. She was 26, from a wealthy family, and had been waiting for Troy to secure his American citizenship so they could build a legitimate business empire together. The plan was for Troy to establish residency, then bring her over on a fiancé visa once he was tragically divorced from his American wife. But what made my blood run cold was discovering how they planned to ensure Lenny wouldn't cause trouble when Troy eventually left her. I overheard Mrs. Chen explaining to a friend in rapid Mandarin how they had documented every argument, every moment of instability from Troy's previous wives. They'd create a narrative of mental health issues, of the American women becoming obsessive and unstable when the marriages fell apart. They had lawyers who specialized in making the divorces look like the women's fault, and they had connections in social services who could support claims of erratic behavior. The key, Mrs. Chen explained to her friend, is to make them doubt themselves first. Make them think they're lucky to have him, that they don't deserve such a good man. Then when he leaves, they're so broken down that they blame themselves instead of fighting back. That evening, I went home and called Lenny, not to warn her, not yet, but to test my growing fears about how far this manipulation had already progressed. "Hi, Mom," she answered, but her voice sounded tired, strained. "Hi, sweetheart. I was just thinking about you. How are the wedding plans going?" "Oh, they're fine. Good. Troy's mother has been so helpful, actually. She's been teaching me about Chinese traditions, making sure I understand how to be a good wife in their culture." The phrase, "good wife in their culture," made my stomach turn. That sounds educational. It is. I mean, I realize now how much I didn't know about being in a relationship with someone from such a traditional family. Mrs. Chen has been helping me understand how I need to change, how to be worthy of Troy. Worthy of Troy. My brilliant daughter, who had graduated summa cum laude from UCLA, who had built a successful career in marketing, who spoke 3 languages and had traveled to 12 countries, was talking about being worthy of a man who saw her as nothing more than a temporary convenience. "What kinds of changes?" I asked carefully. "Well, little things, like not being so independent all the time. American women can be too assertive, too demanding." Mrs. Chen explained that in Chinese families, harmony comes from everyone knowing their role and not pushing boundaries. I gripped the phone tighter. "And what's your role? To support Troy's goals, to make his family comfortable, to not cause drama or make things difficult?" She paused. "Mom, I know this might sound weird, but I think I've been kind of selfish in relationships before, always putting my own needs first instead of thinking about what's best for the family as a whole." Family as a whole. They'd successfully convinced my daughter that her own needs and desires were selfish, that her value came from serving others. "Have you and Troy talked about your plans after the wedding? Where you'll live, how you'll handle finances, that sort of thing?" "Oh, Troy handles all that. He's so much better with money than I am." Mrs. Chen says American women are terrible at managing households because we're too focused on our careers to learn proper domestic skills. I wanted to scream. Instead, I kept my voice level. "So Troy will manage your finances?" "Well, our finances. Once we're married, we'll combine everything." Troy says it's important for wives to trust their husbands completely, not to keep secrets or hold back resources. It shows unity. Unity. They'd convinced her to give him complete financial control under the guise of marital harmony. "That's quite a change from how independent you've always been." "I know, but that's the problem. I was too independent. Troy and his family have helped me see that real love means putting the relationship first, even when it's hard." After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen and cried. Not just for what was going to happen to Lenny, but for what had already happened. They'd broken her down so systematically that she genuinely believed she needed to erase herself to deserve love. That night, I began planning my own strategy. I started by researching Troy's previous wives more thoroughly. Sarah, the teacher from Oregon, was harder to track down, but I eventually found her working at a small elementary school outside Portland. Jennifer, the nurse, had moved back to Arizona and was working at a clinic in Phoenix. I crafted careful emails to both of them, not revealing what I knew, but expressing concerns about a situation involving my daughter and asking if they'd be willing to speak with me about their experiences with Troy's family. Both responded within days, and both agreed to phone calls. Sarah's story was heartbreaking. She'd met Troy at a cultural festival, been charmed by his sophistication and his family's apparent wealth. They'd married quickly, and within months, she was isolated from her friends, convinced that her teaching salary was embarrassing to his family, persuaded to quit her job and depend entirely on him financially. The worst part, Sarah told me, wasn't even the lies about loving me. It was how they made me believe I was the problem. By the time I figured out what was really happening, I was so ashamed and confused that I just wanted to disappear. I signed the divorce papers and left California the same day. Jennifer's experience was nearly identical, with one crucial difference. I kept records, she told me. Something felt off from the beginning, so I documented everything. I have photos of documents, recordings of conversations, evidence of the whole scheme. But I was too traumatized to do anything with it at the time. Would you be willing to share that evidence if it meant stopping them from doing this to other women? The pause on the other end of the line was long. Finally, Jennifer spoke. Are you saying there's another woman? My daughter. Oh my God. Yes, absolutely. Send me your email address. I've been waiting 3 years for someone to ask. By the end of that week, I had enough evidence to destroy Troy's immigration case, expose his family's systematic fraud, and save my daughter from a marriage that would have destroyed her financially and emotionally. But I also had something else. A plan that would give Troy and his family exactly what they deserved, delivered in a way they'd never see coming. The question was timing. The wedding was only 6 weeks away, and Lenny was so deep in their psychological manipulation that a direct approach would likely backfire. I needed to be smarter than that. I needed to beat them at their own game. The engagement party was scheduled for the first Saturday in May, just 6 weeks before the wedding. Lenny had called to invite me, her voice carrying that now familiar strain of someone trying to sound enthusiastic about something that exhausted her. It'll be at the Golden Dragon, of course, she said. Troy's family is hosting, and they've invited about 60 people. It's going to be beautiful. What should I wear? I asked, playing my part as the confused mother who needed guidance. Mrs. Chen said maybe something in navy or gray. Nothing too bright or attention-getting. She wants the focus to be on Troy and me, naturally. I agreed to everything, confirmed the time, and spent the next week preparing for what would be the most important performance of my life. I chose a simple gray dress, modest jewelry, and styled my hair the way I'd worn it to that first disastrous dinner. To everyone watching, I would look exactly like the harmless, slightly pathetic woman they expected me to be. But I also carried something they didn't know about. A small recording device, and the phone numbers of 3 immigration attorneys who specialized in marriage fraud cases. The restaurant was decorated beautifully for the party. Red and gold everything, elaborate floral arrangements, a photographer capturing every moment for what Troy's family believed would be evidence of a legitimate relationship. The guest list was exactly what I'd expected. Troy's extended family, colleagues from the restaurant business, and a few of Lenny's friends who looked increasingly uncomfortable as the evening progressed. I watched my daughter throughout the cocktail hour, seeing her try so hard to be the perfect fiancé. She'd lost weight since I'd last seen her, and there was something brittle about her smile. When Troy's mother introduced her to guests, Lenny stood quietly beside her, nodding and smiling while Mrs. Chen spoke about her as if she were a prize that Troy had won rather than a person with her own accomplishments. Lenny is learning to cook traditional Taiwanese dishes, Mrs. Chen announced to a group of women. It's important that she understand how to properly take care of Troy. American girls don't usually know these things, but she's trying very hard. I watched my daughter's face as this conversation happened. The Lenny I'd raised would have bristled at being talked about like a project that needed improving. This Lenny just nodded and looked grateful for the criticism. The moment I'd been waiting for came during the formal toasts. Troy stood up, champagne glass in hand, to address the room. He started in English, thanking everyone for coming, expressing his love for Lenny, painting a picture of their bright future together. Then he switched to Mandarin, and everything changed. I want to thank my family for their patience with this process, he said, looking directly at his parents. I know it's been difficult to watch me pretend to love this simple American girl, but as we all know, sacrifice is necessary for success. Around the room, his relatives chuckled knowingly. Lenny stood beside him, smiling and nodding, even though she couldn't understand what he was saying. The girl has been useful. I'll give her that. She's already given me access to $15,000 from her savings account for wedding expenses, and she's promised to help me start my own restaurant after we're married. By the time I'm finished with her, there won't be much left. More laughter from the family members. I felt sick thinking about Lenny's excitement when she'd told me about contributing to their shared dream of opening a restaurant. And I have to give special recognition to her mother, Troy continued, raising his glass toward me. The old woman has been even more pathetic than we expected. She's so desperate to be accepted by our family that she'll humiliate herself in any way we ask. It's actually been entertaining to watch. This was my moment. I'd planned it carefully, rehearsed it in my mind dozens of times, but nothing had prepared me for the actual feeling of standing up in that room, in front of 60 people, and shattering the careful illusion that Troy's family had spent months constructing. I rose slowly from my table, and the room gradually quieted as people noticed the movement. Troy was still holding his champagne glass, still smirking at his own cleverness, when I began to speak. "That was a very interesting speech, Troy," I said in perfect, fluent Mandarin that carried clearly across the silent room. The effect was immediate and electric. Troy's face went completely white. Mrs. Chen's champagne glass slipped from her fingers and shattered on the floor. Mr. Chen stood up so quickly his chair fell backward. But I wasn't finished. "I especially enjoyed the part where you called my daughter a simple American girl and described stealing her money as entertainment." I kept my voice calm, conversational, as if I were discussing the weather. And I have to say, calling me pathetic was particularly creative, considering that I've been recording your family's conversations for the past 2 months. The silence in the room was deafening. Lenny was staring at me with her mouth open, clearly struggling to process what was happening. Troy looked like he was about to be sick. I reached into my purse and pulled out a thick folder. "I have documentation of your previous 2 marriages to American women, Troy, Sarah Miller and Jennifer Walsh, both of whom you married for citizenship purposes, both of whom you financially exploited, and both of whom you divorced the moment your green card applications were approved." I opened the folder and began reading from Jennifer's records. Bank statements showing systematic withdrawal of funds from joint accounts. Recorded phone conversations with Wei Lin in Shanghai, your actual fiancé. Discussing timeline for bringing her to America once you've disposed of your current American wife. Troy finally found his voice. "This is ridiculous. You don't know what you're talking about." I smiled at him, and for the first time in months it was genuine. I worked as a translator and cultural liaison at the Chinese consulate for 12 years, Troy. I understand exactly what I'm talking about. In fact, I've already contacted 3 attorneys who specialize in immigration fraud, and they're very interested in your case. Mrs. Chen started saying something rapidly in Mandarin to her son, but I cut her off. "Mrs. Chen, I wouldn't bother trying to coordinate your stories. I have recordings of you explaining your family's methods to your friends, including the part where you discussed how to make American women feel crazy and unstable so they won't fight back when your sons abandon them." Lenny finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mom, I don't understand. What's happening?" I turned to my daughter, and my heart broke seeing the confusion and hurt in her eyes. "Sweetheart, Troy doesn't love you. He's using you to get citizenship so he can bring his real girlfriend here from China. Everything his family told you about changing yourself, about being worthy of him, was designed to make you easier to control and exploit." "That's not true," Lenny said, but her voice wavered with uncertainty. Troy grabbed her arm. "Don't listen to her. She's obviously mentally unstable. This is exactly the kind of behavior that shows why American women let go of my daughter." My voice cut through his words like a blade. "Right now." For the first time since I'd known him, Troy looked genuinely afraid. He released Lenny's arm and stepped backward. I continued speaking to the room, still in Mandarin, making sure every single person understood exactly what was happening. This family has been running marriage fraud schemes for years. They target vulnerable American women, isolate them from their families, drain their resources, and then abandon them with manufactured evidence that the women were the problem. I pulled out my phone and showed the screen to the room. "I'm currently on a conference call with Agent Martinez from Immigration and Customs Enforcement. They've been listening to this entire conversation, and they have several questions for the Chen family." That wasn't actually true, but the effect was immediate. Several family members started heading for the exits. and I could hear multiple urgent phone conversations starting in various corners of the room. Troy made one last desperate attempt. "Lenny, baby, please, don't let her poison your mind against us. We love you. You know we love you." I watched my daughter's face as she looked between Troy and me, seeing the moment when everything clicked into place for her. The weight loss, the constant anxiety, the way she'd been slowly erasing herself to please people who saw her as disposable. "Get away from me," she said quietly. Then louder, "Get away from me." And finally, for the first time in months, I heard my real daughter's voice again. The aftermath of the engagement party was swift and devastating for Troy's family, but liberating for Lenny and me in ways I hadn't dared to hope for. Within 48 hours, Immigration and Customs Enforcement had opened a formal investigation into the Chen family's business practices. While I hadn't actually been on a call with them during my confrontation, the evidence I'd gathered over 2 months was more than enough to trigger serious legal consequences. Jennifer's documentation, combined with Sarah's testimony and my recordings, painted a clear picture of systematic marriage fraud. Troy's visa status was immediately flagged for review. His previous marriages were being investigated, and the engagement to Lenny was noted as a potential continuation of the pattern. The restaurant faced scrutiny for employing people whose immigration status was questionable, and Mrs. Chen's recorded conversations about manipulating American women provided evidence of conspiracy, but the legal consequences, satisfying as they were, weren't the most important part of what happened. The most important part happened in my kitchen 3 days after the party, when Lenny showed up at my door at 7 in the morning, still wearing the clothes she'd slept in, holding a suitcase and crying harder than I'd seen her cry since she was 12 years old. "Mom," she said, and collapsed into my arms. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." I held my daughter while she sobbed against my shoulder, feeling her shake with the force of realizing how close she'd come to destroying her life. When she finally calmed down enough to speak, the words came out in a rush. "I can't believe I let them do that to me. I can't believe I let them do that to you." She pulled back to look at me, her face red and swollen from crying. "Mom, the things they said about you, the way they made me feel ashamed of you, of our life, of everything you did for me." "Shh," I said, smoothing her hair the way I had when she was little. "They're very good at what they do, sweetheart. They've had practice. But I should have known. I should have trusted my instincts. There were so many red flags, and I ignored all of them because I wanted so badly to be part of something that seemed successful and sophisticated." She sat at my kitchen table, the same table where she'd done homework as a teenager, and told me everything. How Troy had slowly convinced her that her job wasn't prestigious enough, her apartment wasn't nice enough, her friends weren't the right kind of people. How Mrs. Chen had systematically undermined her confidence, making her feel grateful for criticism and desperate for approval. "They made me believe that everything about my life before Troy was somehow lacking," Lenny said. "My education, my career, my independence, even you, Mom. They convinced me that I needed to be ashamed of where I came from." I reached across the table and took her hands. "Where you came from is a woman who worked 2 jobs to put you through college, who sacrificed her career to be there when you needed her, who would have done anything to see you happy and successful. There was never anything to be ashamed of. I know that now. I think I knew it then, but I was so seduced by the idea of being special, of being chosen by this successful family, that I convinced myself you were the problem instead of seeing that they were." Over the following weeks, Lenny slowly rebuilt herself. She'd lost $12,000 to wedding expenses that couldn't be recovered, money that Troy had insisted was necessary for their dream wedding, but which had largely gone to pay debts for the restaurant. She'd also discovered that the joint account Troy had convinced her to open had been systematically drained to pay for his actual girlfriend's expenses in Shanghai. But she was young, she was smart, and she still had her job and her apartment. More importantly, she had her clarity back. The wedding, of course, was canceled. Lenny took great satisfaction in calling every vendor personally to explain why the Chen family would no longer be needing their services. Most of them had dealt with Troy's family before and weren't surprised by the revelation. Troy himself tried several desperate attempts to salvage the situation. He called Lenny dozens of times, showing up at her apartment, sending flowers with notes begging for forgiveness, and claiming that everything I'd revealed was lies designed to break them up because I was jealous of their happiness. The final attempt came 6 weeks after the engagement party, when Troy appeared at my house on a Sunday evening. I answered the door to find him standing on my porch, looking haggard and desperate. His usual polish was gone, replaced by the demeanor of someone whose carefully constructed world had collapsed. "Mrs. Rodriguez," he said, "please, I need to talk to you." "There's nothing to discuss, Troy." "Yes, there is. You don't understand. My family, we're not bad people. We were just trying to build a life here, just trying to succeed in America. Sometimes that requires making difficult choices." I looked at him for a long moment. This man who had tried to destroy my daughter's life and had seen me as nothing more than a useful tool in his manipulation. "Troy," I said quietly, "I worked with immigrants for 12 years. I helped hundreds of families navigate the legal path to citizenship. I know the difference between making difficult choices and deliberately hurting people. What you did to my daughter, what your family did to Sarah and Jennifer, wasn't about building a life. It was about taking what you wanted without caring who you destroyed. But Lenny and I could still work. I do care about her. I could learn to love her properly if you just gave us a chance." The audacity of it was breathtaking. "Troy, you told 60 people that watching my daughter humiliate herself for your family's approval was entertaining. You described stealing her money as a game. There is no version of this where you deserve a second chance." He tried a different approach. "What if I could make this worth your while? My family has money, connections. We could help you, help Lenny start over somewhere better." "Are you trying to bribe me?" "I'm trying to find a solution that works for everyone." I stepped closer to him, and for the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. "Troy, the solution that works for everyone is for you to stay away from my daughter, accept the consequences of your choices, and hopefully learn something from this experience that prevents you from hurting other women in the future." That was the last time I saw him. 3 weeks later, Lenny told me that his visa application had been denied and he was being required to leave the country. Wei Lin, his girlfriend in Shanghai, had apparently ended their relationship when the scandal became known in their community. 6 months after the engagement party, Lenny and I were having Sunday dinner together at my house, a tradition we'd reestablished and both treasured. She looked healthy again, confident again, like herself again. "I've been thinking about something," she said as we cleaned up dishes. "All those years when Dad left and you were working 2 jobs, you never once made me feel like I was a burden or that you regretted the sacrifices you made, because I didn't regret them. You were never a burden, Lenny. You were the best thing in my life. But Troy's family made me feel like loving me was a burden, like they were doing me a favor by accepting me. And I started to believe that was normal, that I should be grateful for any attention or acceptance, even if it required me to erase myself." She sat back down at the table and looked at me seriously. "Mom, I want you to know that I understand now what real love looks like. It's what you've shown me my entire life. It's supporting someone while letting them be themselves, not trying to change them into someone else." I felt tears starting and blinked them back. "I'm just glad you're safe, sweetheart. I'm glad you found your way back to yourself." "I found my way back to us," she corrected. "And I'm never forgetting again how lucky I am to be your daughter." As I watched Lenny drive away that evening, I reflected on how strange it was that Troy's attempt to use my love for my daughter against both of us had ultimately brought us closer together than we'd been in years. He'd tried to make me a weakness in Lenny's life, but instead, he'd reminded both of us that the bond between us was stronger than any manipulation. I still work at the DMV, I still live in my same small house, and I still shop for clothes at department stores rather than boutiques. But I've never again felt ashamed of those things. Troy and his family tried to use my ordinary life as a weapon against my daughter's happiness, but in the end, that ordinary life, built on genuine love and sacrifice, was exactly what saved her. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply know your own worth, stay true to yourself, and wait for the right moment to remind others that underestimating you was their mistake, not your limitation. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.